the Chinese Communist Party was aware of Putin's intent to invade. That's at a minimum. At a maximum, I think that there's a possibility that Xi Jinping encouraged this action means that Russia becomes more dependent on China. So exactly, they win either way. In my worst nightmare, the CCP would take over Russia. A major issue that really attacks the CCP is the freedom that the people here in Taiwan have.
Very naturally, a lot of people think of Taiwan when they watch the Ukraine being invaded. Some people compare Taiwan and the Ukraine. What's the similarity and the difference between these two countries, especially about the role of CCP in this war that people may not be aware of? So I interviewed an expert who is a retired U.S. Air Force officer and now a Taiwan fellow in Taipei. And his name is Guermontes Lailari. So Guermontes Lailari is a retired U.S. Air Force foreign area officer specialized in the Middle East and Europe, as well as counterterrorism, irregular warfare, and missile defense. He was a U.S. Air Force attaché in the Middle East, served in Iraq, and holds advanced degrees in international relations and strategic intelligence.
The Russians have always wanted to take over Ukraine, especially Putin. And they have always wanted to control the access around the Black Sea, and they obviously want the resources that Ukraine has. Not only the mineral resources, but it's, they call it the breadbasket of Europe. Some people call it the breadbasket of the world because of the soil and the quantity of food that's produced out of Ukraine. A lot of countries in the world depend on that food. So the fact that not only is Russia has invaded Ukraine again, but that I think the Chinese, at a minimum, knew about it beforehand. The Chinese Communist Party was aware of Putin's intent to invade. That's at a minimum. At a maximum, I think that there's a possibility that Xi Jinping encouraged Putin to invade for this following reason. Mm-hmm. Since Ukraine has the largest lithium and other rare earth minerals in the world, and the intent of Ukraine to join either the EU or NATO concerned China because they want to control the mineral resources, especially the rare earth mineral resources of the world. So if Russia controls that, then and Russia and China have a close relationship, then China basically can control these rare earth minerals. And so it's in China's interest, actually, for Russia to invade and control the eastern province of Ukraine and thereby controlling those mineral resources. So that's kind of where I would be focused on, is the economic reasons for Russia's invasion. Putin talks about the Russians in Ukraine and the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern province, but this is all part of the justification for basically taking over the mineral rights. And by the way, the Sea of Azov, which is a small sea area between Russia and Ukraine on the eastern side, now will be under the control of Russia, and also the oil and gas resources that are associated with it. So there's a lot of interesting economic aspects to this conflict that I think are much more important than some of the concerns that people have mentioned in the United States. Ukraine and Taiwan have a strong connection in that you have a big bully basically harassing another country. And as, again, many people are aware, in 2014, the Russians invaded Ukraine and took Crimea and a couple of areas in the eastern part. So this continuing bullying is similar to what the People's Republic of China is doing against Taiwan, constantly bullying it. And I think it's a very good similarity. There are some differences, but I think that in the big construct, Taiwan and Ukraine are connected, and I think people should think of that in those terms as being a victim of a nuclear-powered bully.
And I remember you wrote whether Russia would win this war, CCP always think it will win. And why is that?
Yeah, I was thinking about this scenario. So on the 4th of February, China, actually Xi Jinping and Putin, signed an agreement, a joint statement, basically saying that they will be best friends forever. And in addition, they both agreed to two very important concepts. One is that the PRC supports Russia against NATO. This is 4 February. This is 3 weeks before Russia invades Ukraine, number one. So the PRC or CCP supports Russia against NATO, and that Russia supports the CCP in the context of Taiwan, and that Taiwan, according to this joint statement, should be part of the PRC. So I was thinking about this joint statement, and it's a long statement. It's 5,000 words. And if you read through it, you start to think that Russia and China are becoming, let's say, an alliance, a strong alliance. And now if let's say Russia wins or controls the eastern province, which looks like it's going to be it's focusing its efforts there. So those mineral, as we talked about earlier, those mineral resources will become part of Russian control, and China will have access to it. If Russia loses, and we've seen that the amount of pressure that the anti-Russian coalition, the NATO, the United States, and many other countries have forced upon Russia, this action means that Russia becomes more dependent on China, because China is willing to do trade with Russia even during the war. So they're still buying Russian gas, Russian oil, Russian products during this war, while the rest of the world is boycotting Russian products. So in either case, as you mentioned, in either case, China wins, because Russia is feeling the economic weight of all these sanctions and is forced to depend on China, on the PRC. And if it wins, then the PRC benefits from the mineral rights. So exactly, they win either way. I think it's actually quite smart on their part. Unfortunately, I don't think it's good news for the West.
What does that mean to the West and to United States and to the whole world when these two forces join together?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the history of the relationship between the PRC, Russia, and the United States, it's always been either Russia and the United States are opposed to each other, and China has been kind of neutral, and vice versa. Recently, we've been more, prior to the Ukrainian war, we've been more friendly to Russia, and our relationship with China has become, especially against the CCP, has been increasingly tense. But to have the PRC and Russia joined strategically and to work together, I think this will be an interesting challenge, because the CCP is an organization that has its ability to continue on and to continue to beyond Xi Jinping. You know, he has to die at some point. So the leadership of the CCP will decide who will follow him. I'm not so sure what's going to happen to Putin. I mean, eventually he will either get out of office or he will pass away. And the replacement of Putin, I'm sure that the CCP will have strong interest in making sure that replacement is friendly to them. And in the worst case scenario, could be a puppet of the CCP. Actually, even a worst case scenario is that, I guess in my worst nightmare, the CCP would take over Russia. And that would be pretty catastrophic, I think, in terms of the world future, because of the vast resources that Russia has just in itself. It has like 11 or 12 time zones. It's a huge country, but a very small population. So this would make, in my estimation, the CCP much more powerful.
President Trump really tried to pull Putin over. How do you think such kind of strategy?
Well, I think it was a good strategy. I mean, I think that trying to pull away from the CCP and pull in Russia would be the best strategy, and to try to make it, let's say, more European. I mean, it has European roots. They are, let's say, at least Christian, just like the rest of Europe. They have similar values, similar traditions. Obviously, the language is a bit different, but still, the philosophy is Western philosophy, and I think that all those things combined would make it more easy to bring Russia into the Western. Unfortunately, because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the West is becoming a bit for sure anti-Putin, but potentially anti-Russian. And I hope that once the war stops, that we can work to bring Russia back into, let's say, a role where we work with them. Because like I mentioned, I think pushing Russia towards China is a mistake, long term.
And you mentioned Taiwan and Ukraine, are very similar, but also have some differences. Yeah, could you elaborate on that?
Yes. Okay, so let me just mention a few similarities before we go to the differences so that people understand. Taiwan is a full-fledged democracy with almost 24 million people living on a main island and several other smaller islands. It is close to a superpower, i.e. the PRC, just like Ukraine. But here are some of the differences. The Ukrainian people can, if they're able to travel, they're able to, the civilians especially, are able to escape to their western border. They can go to Poland, Romania, etc. The problem with Taiwan is that it has no land bridge to anywhere. And so if the People's Liberation Army surrounds Taiwan with its navy and with its aircraft, it can effectively blockade the entire country, whereas the Russians could not do that. I'm sure they wanted to do that, especially to prevent weapons from being shipped into Ukraine and being used against them with disastrous effects from their point of view. So if Taiwan were to be blockaded, it would be a challenge to send weapons and for people to escape because there is no place to escape. So that is a big issue in my mind. And my concern is that we're so focused on supplying weapons to Ukraine that Taiwan is being forgotten. And it's my belief that we should be also supplying similar weapons in addition to other weapons such as anti-ship and anti-missile weapon systems to Taiwan now before the CCP orders the PLA to invade Taiwan, because I'm not so sure that once the invasion starts that anyone's going to be able to provide any kind of military support to Taiwan. So that is a big difference in my opinion. There are other differences too, but that is the biggest one.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, I just interviewed Professor Victor Hansen with the Hoover Institute. He also mentioned that actually the United States should have supplied anti-ship missile to Ukraine as well, so that the Russians won't get into the Black Sea port.
Exactly. So in terms of weapon systems, Taiwan does have its own anti-ship, and it has bought the Harpoon weapon system, which is a U.S. system. Um, but my concern is not so much that they have the system, but the quantity. As we know, the PLA Navy has thousands of ships, and not only the Navy, but the Coast Guard and other ships could be used for an invasion. And when you're dealing with that number of ships, the number of weapon system missiles available will quickly deplete, and they won't have any more, let's say. The other issue is that the enemy has a vote in the war, and so I'm sure the PLA is also looking at where these weapon systems are and are planning to target them so that they don't become a victim of these weapon systems. So there has to be not only enough, but it has to be extra to deal with the fact that the enemy has the vote in terms of destroying let's say your weapon stores or wherever you have these systems could be targeted. And so there has to be an excess amount. So I don't know if there is sufficient, but I suspect that there is not. And I suspect that they would need a lot more than they have now. So I've written an article or two about the fact that I think that we should also send anti-air, anti-tank, anti-ship, and anti-missile systems to Taiwan, not only from the US, but from many other countries, so that A, Taiwan has the systems, and B, they have time to train on them prior to a conflict. And the effect of this would be to deter the CCP from ordering the PLA to invade. The more the pain that the Taiwanese military can cause against the PLA, I think is a good thing. And the more that they fear what would happen to them, and I think using Ukraine as an example of how badly the Russians have been beat is important to reemphasize what the Taiwanese military will do against the People's Liberation Army in the same vein. So the more weapon systems, the more time they have for training, the better, in my opinion. I think the results of the Ukrainian war have caused the CCP to delay the invasion because they see what happens when a dedicated population is willing to resist. So I hope they delay it indefinitely.
The Taiwan government, would they do anything to address the problem that you saw? That they really need to beef up the weapons, anti-ship, anti-air missiles,
Yes.
things like that.
I think they are aware, and I think they're doing some things. For example, the current requirement for service in the military in Taiwan is 4 months. And the current administration is talking about increasing it to 10 months or to a year. So doubling it or tripling it because of this increased concern. Taiwan also has its own capabilities to build its own weapon systems. They have their own anti-air system. They have their own anti-ship system. They have their own anti-missile system. Not because they're very clever at doing things, but because they're forced to build their own system because no one would be willing to give them systems or allow them to buy systems. This occurred, for example, with the submarines. There was a lot of pressure put on by the CCP to prevent Taiwan from getting any kind of submarine system. So consequently, that forced the Taiwanese government to spend money to build from scratch, to build their own submarine system. And in the next couple of years, they're going to have an additional 6 submarines, for example. So the Taiwanese government is put in a hard situation where they are forced to fend for themselves, which is in some sense it's a good thing, but also it might not be sufficient because of the size and force that the PLA could bring against Taiwan. So that's why it's important for the rest of the world to provide support as they can, just as they have with Ukraine. And that's why I think it's very important to tie Ukraine and Taiwan very tightly together, because this is the strongest argument to help Taiwan. And this is exactly what the propaganda people in the CCP are trying to stop, because they don't want the rest of the world to feel sympathy towards Taiwan. They want people to think that Taiwan is a what they call a rogue province, and it's an internal affair. But the more that people connect between Ukraine and Taiwan, the better it is for Taiwan, and it's better for the rest of the world to show sympathy and to actually provide help that is useful to Taiwan.
So, Guermontes, since you arrived and lived in Taiwan for 1 month now, and that's during the Ukraine war, how do you see the atmosphere in Taiwan in regards to how they view this war, and also relates to how Taiwan could be potentially attacked by CCP?
So I'll answer it in two different ways. I'll answer it from the point of view of discussions I've had with people on the street, or just people I've been interviewing for my research, and then also the polling that's been going on in Taiwan. So based on just my interactions with people here in Taiwan, it has increased their awareness of the threat of the CCP. And I think it's a good thing. Unfortunately, it's not a good thing for Ukraine, but for the Taiwanese people to become more concerned is a good thing, and to take it more seriously is a good thing. You know, what happened to Hong Kong was also traumatic for the Taiwanese people. Mm-hmm. Many of them have relatives there, and they have done business with people in Hong Kong. And so in the same sense, Ukraine was another reminder of the fact that when you have aggressive, autocratic superpowers with small neighbors, or neighbors that don't have nuclear weapons, you become vulnerable. And so the people in Taiwan have become more energized. And I think the political environment is more likely to support a more aggressive pursuit of preparedness. And I think not only military side, but I think the resilience of society is important. And so it's not just weapons. It's also about the people's minds and how they support the idea of resisting an invasion, and how they have practical means to deal with this. And I think the resilience factor it has become stronger, and in a positive way. Now, in terms of polling, yes, I think that what I've read is that the polls have indicated that the Taiwanese people have become more and more concerned about an invasion, but not to the point where they're fearful. But I think an increased amount to the point where they understand that it's serious, and that they need to plan and deal with this. So, in the psychology part of it, I think they've come to understand that it is serious, and they need to prepare. So I think enough people in Taiwan are dedicated enough to resist an invasion. I think the polling said that 70% of the people in Taiwan would be willing to fight against the PLA should they invade. And this number is a dramatic increase from prior to the Ukrainian-Russian war. So these are all good things. And I think that Taiwan should take advantage of this sense of urgency and push their people to increase their readiness, preparedness, and also ask their allies and friends to help them where they need help.
A while ago, it was said Russia has been downgraded to a secondary threat, right? The top threat is the CCP. How do you think United States right now treating the threat of the CCP? Is it enough? They realize enough it's the biggest threat, or is there any concerns do you have?
Let me break it up into several different dimensions. In terms of the nuclear weapons threat, Russia currently has more nuclear weapons than China does. And so in terms of a nuclear war, Russia is a greater threat. But China, the PLA specifically, is building a huge amount of missile launch sites, mainly in the center north and center western part of China. And so those missile fields, estimated right now, currently, to be 300 missile silos, each with a potential of 3 nuclear warheads on each one. Once those are built and they're operational, that would mean that the PRC would be almost an equivalent threat in terms of ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile threat to the United States. So they're building to that threat on the nuclear side. But on the economy side, the PRC is leaps and bounds ahead of Russia. They are number 2 in terms of economy, and they're probably going to be number 1 eventually, just due to their size, population, and their industry, and what they've stolen from the West in terms of intellectual property. The problem is that in my opinion, is that the CCP has done actions to sort of just below the level of conflict. They've pushed in the South China Sea. They've pushed through their Belt and Road Initiative. They've pushed different initiatives around the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, everywhere, Europe. And so they are expanding at an incredible amount compared to, let's say, Russia is pretty stagnant. So the problem is that the U.S. and the West are asleep. They don't see the threat as serious as it is. And that's the problem, is that the CCP is smart in terms of not waking up the giant that the West can be. And so I think that's why the PRC, specifically the Chinese Communist Party, is a much graver threat, because they're, I guess a good word would be they're sneaky. They're able to do things that do not provoke us in a big way, but they're constantly pushing and pushing and pushing everywhere. And so the US and the West and the other allies, Japan, Australia, India, are not forced to make a sudden move. They're lulled into sort of this economic business, trade. But the CCP will conduct military operations eventually. They have to, because they're building such a large military. In fact, for example, the PLA Navy is larger today than the U.S., and it's going to be larger next year as even the U.S. is drawing down the number of ships that we're producing, and the number of ships that are retiring. Our numbers are going to continue to go down. In the military sense, we're weaker. In the economic sense, they're catching up, and I think that they have a strategy that will keep us just below reacting to their behavior. Now, of course, the invasion of Taiwan would be an activity that would activate us, but the question is what would they do? I mean, one of my scenarios that I've thought about strongly is the PLA could just conduct a blockade around Taiwan and declare that anyone who interfered with it would be an act of war, and that they would respond accordingly. In other words, threaten nuclear war, and just as Russia has threatened the same thing about Ukraine. And so, if they conduct a blockade against Taiwan, I'm not so sure what the West will do, because there's nobody being killed. There's no media that shows people dying, as in Ukraine. But in effect, it puts a lot of pressure on the Taiwanese people to survive without any kind of outside help. And so this is something that I think, in terms of if they wanted to do a slow type of aggression, this would be an option for them. And I think that would be problematic for the rest of the world to deal with. So there are a lot of things that I'm concerned about with the PRC, and I think as long as we are asleep and not having let's say a strategic plan to deal with them, I think they're going to continue to be an increasing threat, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with them before they become a threat that we can't deal with anymore.
Janet Yellen was talking about if CCP does invade Taiwan, for sure, United States gonna just use all kinds of sanction against Chinese government. How do you think this type of a reaction, would that be sufficient enough to curb the CCP?
I heard a speaker a couple days ago mention what they thought was the vital interests of the CCP. Number one is internal stability. Number two is their borders, secure borders. And number three is the economy. So secure borders falls into the Taiwan framework. It's more important to them than the economy. Again, according to this list that this panel was talking about. And so I would argue that that any kind of economic boycott of the PRC would be painful, not only for the PRC, but for the rest of the world, because the rest of the world does depend on a lot of production coming out of the PRC. But as we saw in the case of Russia, that didn't stop Putin from continuing his war against Ukraine. I don't know of any example in history where boycotts have been successful in terms of preventing the leadership of the country from pursuing war if they wanted to do it. Even though it might not make economic sense, people forget that the economy is not necessarily the only thing that people think about. So, as I mentioned, in the case of the PRC, CCP believes that their borders are more important, secure borders are more important, and they believe that Taiwan is a part of their borders, and they don't have an issue, in my opinion. Now, remember that Xi Jinping also has directed his people to develop what they call a dual circulation concept within China. In other words, make China more independent of the exterior economy. Now, obviously, they're not there yet, and they won't be there for a long time, but they're moving in that direction. Russia was also moving in that direction immediately following the 2014 war, where the West also conducted some sanctions against Russia. But that, again, didn't stop them from doing a second invasion of Ukraine. So I don't think that sanctions will stop the CCP from taking Taiwan.
Yeah, I came from China. I know the political goal is more important for them than people's life, how they live in China.
Yes, I mean, and I'm sure you understand this more than I do, is that in the United States, the people are the sovereign. They are in charge of the government. They can change the government. They have the ability to do that. And we have freedom of thought, freedom of speech. And in China, the people serve the Communist Party. And everything supports the Communist Party. The PLA serves the Communist Party. The United States, the military serves the Constitution. And serves the people. But in communist China, the PLA serves the party, and the party is ultimately in charge and makes all decisions. There is no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of religion. There's no freedom whatsoever, and so it's everything reversed. I'm sure that you and many others have seen this close hand, and it's very important for people to understand that when the CCP decides to do something against Taiwan, it's not merely an invasion, it's also oppression of another group of people that are currently democratic, living in freedom, able to vote, and able to think whatever they want to think. Once the CCP takes over, as we saw in Hong Kong, and as we've seen in Tibet, and every other place that they've taken over regions from the people who live there, that this is the way that they operate. The CCP is the religion of the PRC.
Very well said. Anything else you would like to share with our audience?
One important thing to understand is that democracy is a threat to the CCP. The freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to be equal under the law, be able to appeal decisions, all these things that we take for granted in Western democracies is poison to the CCP. And I think one of the reasons, maybe the biggest reason, besides the fact that that Taiwan is close to China and has this Chinese-speaking population, I think a major issue that really attacks the CCP is the freedom that people here in Taiwan have. And I think used effectively, it could attack the internal stability of the PRC. As we saw in Tiananmen Square in 1989, where over 10,000 people were killed. Freedom is something that the CCP fears. And I think this is one of the reasons why, maybe the major reason why they want to take over Taiwan. And I think it's something that, as a tool, that maybe this is one area that we should be emphasizing a lot more to affect the people that live under the rule of the CCP.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you, Guermontes, again for coming on to our show and sharing your insights of those issues.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.